Hello, everyone. This is your 5-minute notice. The webinar will begin shortly at 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's amazing webinar, You and the Future of Doing Good. My name is Tony Bell, and I am a trainer for the Sanford Institute of Philanthropy, and I will be your facilitator for today's webinar. Before we get started, a couple of notes for you. This webinar will be conversational with the opportunity to ask questions during the webinar, as well as a Q&A following the presentation. Please submit any questions you have in the chat box using your GoToWebinar control panel. In the days following the webinar, you will receive an email with the slide deck and recording to review again at your leisure. We'd like to send a quick shout out to our affiliate partners who provide training and education to fundraisers nationally. Check out the map to find an institute in your community. This is SIP's mission statement, which demonstrates our commitment to building up the fundraising sector through education and training. If you're on social media, and who isn't, please give us a shout out using the hashtag #SIPWebinar and tag us. Now I am pleased to introduce our presenter, Trista Harris. Trista is a philanthropic futurist and nationally known as a passionate advocate for new leaders in the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors. Trista has been featured on CNN, and her work has been covered by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, the New York Times, Minneapolis Journal, Forbes, and numerous social sector blogs. She's an international speaker on using the tools of futurism to solve society's biggest challenges. A sought-after speaker, she is the author of How to Become a Nonprofit Rockstar and FutureGood, which was released on October 19th. In her professional life, Trista is president of FutureGood, which is a consultancy focused on building a better future. Please welcome Trista. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Tony. I really appreciate it. If you're tweeting away today, this is my handle at Trista Harris. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got interested in the future in the first place. In 2008, I was president of the Headwaters Foundation for Justice, and I had a little post-it note on my computer that said, "Learn how endowments work." And a couple months into the job, the economy completely collapsed, and our endowment was worth between half and 30% of what it was before the collapse. And so in that process, I was trying to figure out what the heck is coming next. And when I talked to my peers at much larger foundations, there wasn't really a clear path forward. Nobody was really sure what was coming next for the sector. And that made me really disappointed, because I feel like people that do good for a living need to have a clear understanding of what's coming up that's important for the sector. And so that allowed me to sort of go down this journey where I wanted to learn as much as I could about what was coming next that was going to impact the nonprofit sector. Normally I give these sort of presentations and I give you an idea of what the future is going to look like. So I give you different trends and ideas that will impact your work. And I usually sit in that space of me telling you what's coming next. But I've started to get a little frustrated with that model, because I am one person and the issues that we're facing in the field are many. And instead, I want to come to the place where all people that work in the nonprofit sector have a clear view of what's coming next and how that's going to impact your work. So over the last 10 years, I've been on my own journey to figure out what's happening with the future. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I've learned along the way. So over this course of time, I've interviewed experts in dozens of fields, including human genome mapping, disaster first response, virtual reality, asteroid mining. I've gone to the Oxford Scenarios program to learn about what's coming next. I even stalked and ended up on the island of a billionaire that I think has a unique perspective of what's coming next for the future. This is the billionaire. So my friends like to say that I Ferris Buellered my way onto Necker Island. I did all this because I want the future to be a lot clearer for you as you do your work. The things that you're doing are so important, and I want you to have all the tools that are available to do that. So the things that I'm going to be talking to you about are from my new book, which is called FutureGood. So through all these conversations and talking to folks, I've developed a model of the future to make it accessible for you. I think my biggest frustration when I first tried to learn what was coming next is that futurists often made the future feel really confusing. And I finally figured that out. It's because futurists make a ton of money coming in and saying, let me explain what's coming next. And it really is not that difficult. So today I'm going to be sharing with you a model that's in this book called FutureGood that helps you really consider how to both understand what's coming next and then shape those future trends. So as Tony said, the book came out a couple weeks ago. The first run of it sold out. There is a second print of the book that is coming out this week, and you can get your copy at tristaharris.org. So before we get started, I have a question for you. As you think about the future, do you think we're headed towards a future where we use knowledge to explore different spaces and sort of make friends around the universe? Or do you think we're headed towards a Hunger Game future where there aren't enough resources for everybody and we make kids hunt each other? So you've got an opportunity now to give your answer. Rachel, do you want to give us directions?
Yes, thank you, Trista. So a poll is going to launch on your screen. Please select your response. If you are choosing other, please submit that response via the questions box, and we will read those out loud. So we'll give you all about a little less than a minute to get your responses in, and then we'll look at the results. All right, we'll give you guys another 10 seconds to get your responses in. Actually, I still see responses coming in. The results are very interesting. So I'll give you guys another 10, 15 seconds, get your responses in, and we will share them shortly. Okay, we're going to close the poll and take a look at the results.
Oh, interesting. Look at this evenly split. So I was wondering if you guys were a hopeful audience or if I was going to have to convince you that we actually could have a much more positive future. And it looks like it's split right down the row. So we'll see what I can do.
And Trista,
what were some of the
yeah, let me read some of the responses that came into our questions box. So someone says, my hope is for Star Trek, but I think we may be headed for more of a parable of the sour or a Hunger Games future. Another person said, I think it will be a bit of both. There has always been a bit of both. And another person said, it depends on where you are.
Oh, interesting. Yep. Great answers. Thank you for your thoughtful responses to the question. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. For some of the baby boomers in the audience, you may remember the 1960s as a time as a nation where we were hopeful about the future. We had the space program, modernist design, even the Jetsons. I thought we were going to have this like robot in our house cleaning up and cooking for us. And now we just have, you know, a Roomba that's sort of bouncing against the walls. But since then, our view of the future has gotten much more negative. And so as you think about movies like the Hunger Games that we just talked about, or The Matrix, or even the cartoon WALL-E, the planet is destroyed by garbage in that example. And we started to treat the future like it's something that happens to us rather than something that we create with the decisions that we make today. I think that that is complete nonsense. I think that the future is really visible, and we can learn how to notice the signs that are giving us the hints about what's coming next, and we can create a better future. So there are just 3 simple steps that, if practiced consistently, will help you both predict and shape the future as fundraisers in your organization. The first step is stop. And this means stop loving the problem. How many of you have been in meetings where you're spending your whole time talking about how terrible the world is? Knowing the scope of the issues that you're working on is really, really helpful, but it cannot be the end of your activity. It can be really counterproductive to spend all of your time and energy thinking about what doesn't work. So you have to stop making the problem your guest of honor. As you're hosting meetings, as you're writing grant applications, how do you move to the place where you have a solutions mentality? And then check your communications. So for many of us, as you're framing both your grant application and framing how you talk about the work that your organization does, we talk about how bad the conditions are that we're moving through. Instead of sitting in this sort of solutions frame place. Foundations have really made this a status quo. It's sort of the comparison of who's dealing with the worst issues in community. And I think that that's work that foundations have to do to start to move to the place where they're actually asking for a solutions mindset. We have to start asking organizations what they're building rather than how terrible everything is. The last way to stop loving the problem is to move the conversation. So if you are sitting in a meeting and people are going on and on talking about how terrible things are, ask pointed questions about possible solutions to help people sort of move past that natural block that we have. Really important that we spend time envisioning what the world would look like if the problems that we care about are fully solved. And that's something that we don't spend a lot of time doing in the sector. So if you were an after-school program and you were doing a traditional planning process, you would probably say in 2 or 3 years, we'd like to serve 10% more kids and have 15% more revenue. But if you envisioned what the world would look like if your program was completely successful, what it would probably look like is that kids don't need an after-school activity that's academic-based because they're getting what they need during the school day. And if you backed it up to figure out what it would take to actually get to that preferred future, it probably isn't serving more kids. Maybe it's teacher training. Maybe it's lobbying to make sure that schools have the sort of funding that they need to be successful. Suddenly the activities that you're doing to get there are really different than what you're doing in your day-to-day. So by stopping the problem and instead thinking about what you want the world to look like, really interesting solutions can show themselves. The next phase is look. And look is about looking for signals of what the future is going to look like. There's a quote that says the future already exists, it's just not evenly distributed. And so I think for many of us, making the time in your day-to-day to pay attention to what's coming next helps you to understand what the future looks like. We can't just be flexible when change comes. We've asked nonprofits to be really flexible and adaptable. I think we now need to anticipate what's coming next and prepare for that change before it happens. So how do you do this? You pay attention to some of those signals of the future. I think a way to do that is to set aside 5% of your time for research and development. We don't talk enough in nonprofits about research and development, but if I talk to a CEO at a Fortune 500 company and ask them why they were spending so much money and time in R&D, they'd say it's the lifeblood of their organization. That's how they ensure that their company has a future. I think we need to do the same thing in nonprofits. So setting aside 5% of your time to think 5 to 50 years in the future for the communities and the issues that you care about, reading that pile of articles and newsletters that we have built up, that it feels like, I think there's something exciting that's in here, but I don't have enough time to dig a little bit deeper. Setting that time aside in your schedule makes it possible for you to start to notice some of those trends. I keep a notebook in Evernote about different trends that I'm paying attention to. So I'm paying attention to the future of nonprofit organizations. I'm paying attention to self-driving cars. I'm paying attention to what I think cities are going to look like in the future. And anytime I am forwarded an article or I'm on a website that has a description that I think is tied to that, I just connect it to that notebook. And then when I'm spending that 5% time, I go back and I look and read those articles and just start to write notes to myself about what I think that means for the issues and causes that I care about. Another way to do this, sometimes when I get stuck, I was running a membership association of foundations, and we were trying to figure out how to make our programs more accessible for our membership. And one of the things that we were trying to figure out is how to deepen that engagement of our membership. And so in that process, I just picked random TED Talks. So I just picked ones that were on the front page of the website. And what I asked myself is, what do these TED Talks have to do with this problem that I'm facing? And so one of the talks that I found is called The Power of Introverts. And so in that TED Talk, I figured out that we were actually designing all of our programs for people that were extroverted. So in that process, the only way that you were getting access within programs is if you ask questions and sort of raise your hand and said, hey, what does this mean for me and for the things that I'm doing? And after watching The Power of the Introverts, I realized that we needed to figure out a new way to do that. And so we went back to the drawing board and instead developed a sort of like Facebook for philanthropy, where people could connect after a program and post resources and post questions, both of the speaker and of each other, share resources, and then come back at a later time. So maybe you don't have a question about reading in 990 now, but maybe you have one later. And in that process, what we found is that our members that weren't asking questions while they were sitting around the table were the most engaged as they were sitting around the computer screen. And I think for all of us, sometimes having those random inputs and different ways of thinking and learning what people are learning from other sectors really can help us find unusual solutions. So one of the things that I pay attention to is the future of philanthropy. And I think, you know, there's a way that philanthropy has always worked, and many of you are engaging in that now as you're fundraising. There's a top-down governance process where there's board of director that's making decisions, a very deliberate process. So first there's a letter of inquiry, then there's an application, then there's a board meeting. Everybody's sort of clear, at least around the grant making side, what those steps are in that decision-making process. Usually a very small scale, so supporting one organization at a time, really explicit metrics. So you know that if you invest X, Y is what's supposed to happen. Incremental, sort of small impact that we're seeing, and sometimes problems are actually getting worse faster than the ways that we're trying to solve them. And then tempered speed, which means that foundations are very slow to make decisions. So at the very same time, we have signals of what the future is going to look like. And I think that the future of philanthropy involves participatory governance, so people that are impacted by problems also sitting around the table making decisions about what those solutions look like. I think Mark Zuckerberg giving his gift to an LLC instead of a traditional 501c3 structure is a signal of what's coming next. And I think the growth that we've seen in giving directly and crowdfunding are signals of what's coming next in the organization. There's even places now where you can text a gift to somebody in a developing and they will receive that gift directly. So I think what's coming next for philanthropy are evolving flexible processes. So foundations that are able to have multiple grant rounds at the same time. Some of those grants are for organizations that they've been supporting for a number of years. Some of them for emerging issues. Some of them for disasters and sort of first response things that need to come up. I think the scale will be multiple more likely more often. And so that means things like collective impact tables where many organizations are coming together to solve really complicated problems, but they're working together to do it. And foundations are funding the coordination of those tables and the separate work that's happening as a result of it. I think we're going to see more immediate speed. So this, 1 year process between application and grant is going to be much too long. And foundations are going to learn how to speed up that process and make sure that dollars are available more quickly to emerging community needs. I think that we will move to the place where there's transformative impact, where we're actually solving the problems that we're working on instead of making them not as terrible. And I think that we'll also move to more implied metrics. So we've come to the place in philanthropy where everybody wants those metrics so tight, and you have to have a PhD on staff to be able to describe the sort of work that's happening. If you are funding a collective impact table, who knows what the impact of that work is going to be, but it's going to be something good. And I think for many funders, they are moving towards a place where they let go of this idea of having to know in advance what everything is going to look like. What I really appreciate about this model is that first curve that you saw. When you move towards the future, which is the right side of your screen, you don't have to let go of everything. So for foundations, they're going to keep what works. And that means things like donor intent, deep relationships and communities, skilled staff. It's really different in each organization. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You really move to the place where you're able to think about what's coming next as you're doing today's work. I think that the challenge that we're facing is that these two curves are intersecting. And so what happens is organizations have the systems of the first curve, but they have the pull of the results of the second curve. So some organizations like Charity Water has been completely built on the second curve of philanthropy. And for more traditional institutions that want to still work in that same area and have that impact, they're frustrated because they don't have the systems and tools and flexibility that allows them to get there. So for fundraisers, back up for 1 second. For fundraisers, here's some ways that you can think about these trends. There's going to be a lot more collaborative work that is expected. I know that that work is difficult. It is not easy to convene multiple organizations and work on big, hairy problems. But that's really the way that we get things done, and learning how to collaborate and work together better. And being clear about how to split revenue from foundations and split expenses and all of those sort of things are going to have to be more of our day-to-day work. And for fundraisers, I think often you'll act as negotiators in this process of making that happen. I think foundations will be asking more about how people that are impacted by problems are part of the solution that your organizations are developing. There's a lot less patience for sort of helicopter solutions where nonprofit organizations come into communities and say, you have something wrong, we are going to fix it for you. Instead, the expectation is going to be, how is community informing what they want fixed, and how are they around the table as those solutions are being developed? And then on the measurement piece, I think we're going to have a lot more interesting measurement tools. Mission Measurement is an organization that describes one of their tools that they've developed as Pandora for impact. So if you think of Pandora, the music's service that says, like, if you like this song, you might like another. Mission Measurement is developing a system that says, if you like third grade reading scores, you might like these inputs that actually create more positive third grade reading scores. So on the fundraising side, I think we're going to have to develop new partnerships to be able to get clear about the impact of our work and how we're talking about that work. So the future can also be personal. It isn't always about the issues and causes that you care about. It's also about you as professionals within your organization. Can you think about the level of impact that you want to have through your work, and how you think about what's next for yourself? So there's a process that I use, a weekly review process. So if you Google Trista Harris and weekly review, you'll be able to pull up some of these questions. And what I do is I have a single Word document for the year, and I put the date, and I've got these list of questions that I fill out every single week. It takes me 10 or 15 minutes, and they're questions that are things like, what was your most enjoyable work activity for the week? Describe the impact that you had with the people that you work with and the causes that you care about. When were you bored? What was your biggest and most exciting challenge this week? What distractions came up that prevented you from achieving your big goals? What are some things that you can do to prevent those distractions from happening in the future? So I've been doing this every week the last 8 years, and it helps me to see patterns that I'm missing in my day-to-day life. So as we just talked about in this look step about every week setting aside a little bit of time to pay attention to different trends, this is the same thing but for yourself. So how do you pay attention to the trends that are happening in your own life? So I found for myself one of the times that I was consistently getting bored when I was at home at night and I was surfing the internet and not accomplishing anything. And so it felt like these big, huge chunks of time that were completely wasted. And I noticed week after week that that showed up as a time that I was bored. So eventually, when you see something so many times, you actually have to do something about it. So what I did is I got a charging station for my phone and for everybody else's phone in my family to put downstairs so that it wasn't something that I had upstairs when I was in the bed. And then I got an Alexa because my excuse was I needed my cell phone because I needed my alarm. So I got an Alexa that could tell me the weather, could tell me the appointments that I have for the day, could wake me up in the morning, and it broke apart that bad habit. I think the other thing that I've noticed in the weekly review is the parts of my work that I really love and the parts that are really frustrating. And so as you start to notice those trends, it helps you refine your career a little bit, where you say, maybe I should be spending my time doing more of this thing rather than this other thing. Maybe I should delegate this other thing that I know how to do, but makes me really frustrated and makes me feel like I'm not making the difference that I want to make. So the last step is go. And I think as a field, we need to learn how to fail faster. I know that's a little bit counterintuitive, and I often hear from nonprofits when I'm describing this piece of advice, they say we actually can't afford to fail because we are serving children that have all of these barriers and we can't face them, or facing communities that have huge needs, and it's unfair to fail them. And what I think is happening in the nonprofit sector is that we are failing, but we're just doing it really slowly because we refuse to innovate. And so what I'd rather see us do is test out some of the ideas from the Look Step, maybe just in one of your organization's programs or in one geographic area that you work in. Do a 6-week trial and see if the idea makes any difference. And if it doesn't, pick something else. And if it does, then figure out how to spread it farther within your organization. I think the other important part is that we have to share what we're learning in this process, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We love to talk about when things are fantastic, but we don't talk about when things didn't work too well for us. And I think many of us in our organizations are banging our heads on things that somebody else has already banged their head on, even within our organization, and they don't want to tell us about it because they're embarrassed. I think we have to move to the place where we freely share those mistakes. The Case Foundation had a project a few years ago where they encouraged people both in nonprofits and foundations to share their mistakes with each other. And I was at a philanthropy conference where they funded a happy hour where they gave people free drinks and a microphone, and you were expected to share your failures. I think we need more of those places so that we're not all making the same mistakes over and over again. So lastly, this is my favorite quote about the future. The best way to predict the future is to create it. We're entering a time of unbelievable exponential change, and it is faster and quicker than it has ever been in human history. For most of human history, the way that your parents lived, their life looked just like theirs. Your dad was a farmer, you became a farmer. Your mom raised kids, you raised kids. And it hasn't been that long where suddenly what children and parents do is unbelievably different. My life looks completely different than it did just when I was in college. And I have no idea what it's going to look like when my kids are fully grown. And so that pace of change is really exhausting to people. And I think many of us are sort of sitting with the false hope that it feels really busy right now, but it'll calm down and next year will be easier. Or if we're in a different political environment, then things will calm down. I think the piece that we have to understand is that we are in a sort of curve in humanity where we're at the dip of the curve now, and that change is only going to get faster and it's only going to get more intense. And so as people that do good for a living, we have to understand what's farther up the curve so that we can prepare for it. And I think that we are going to have to move to the place where we really take good care of ourselves and take care of each other in this process of transformation and transition. So I think we need masses of visionaries that are willing to play big and that are willing to work really hard to solve challenging problems. And we need each of you to be able to create your dent and build a better future. So if you want to learn more about some of these trends, or if you want to come to any of the retreats that I host about how to become a more future-focused leader, you can check those out at tristaharris.org. I think it's really important for all of us to become more future-wise as we do this work, because because the causes and communities that we care about are our very best and deserve all the tools that we have at our disposal to make a difference. So thank you so much for having me today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Trista. I love these opportunities that we have, like today, that really challenge us to think and act differently in the roles that we play in really changing the lives of the communities that we're serving. So really, thank you so much for this great information. Now we'd like to open the conversation up for questions. So everyone attending, please submit any questions you have via the chat box in your GoToWebinar control panel. Meanwhile, we'll get started with a few of the questions we've already received so far. So Trista, one of those questions that we received is pretty good. Are you hopeful about the future?
I am. I've always been very sort of Pollyannish and hopeful about what's coming next. And I think now in particular, we can't let a good crisis go to waste. There are lots of people that are suddenly paying attention to really critical issues, that are willing to be partners in new ways. And I think we have to take advantage of that. So I am unbelievably hopeful about what the next phase looks like. There's an organization called Singularity University that does a lot of work about some of the technological fixes to things like climate change and water access. And they believe that within 20 years, we are going to be able to solve some of society's greatest challenges. So things like unlimited free energy, which then creates unlimited free water, which then creates access to do farming in places that we haven't been able to do in the past. And as I've talked to some of their folks there about if they're hopeful about the future, they're very hopeful about that 20-year point. But they're wondering, are people going to make it the 20 years? Because in times of transition, we start to tear each other down in really terrible ways. And I think all of this rise of neo-Nazi stuff that we have going on is really about fear of artificial intelligence and robotics. But there's an old story that immigrants and people of color are taking our jobs. So if people don't understand how technology is actually changing the job market, then they tell an old story. And it means that people start to divide and attack each other in really, really terrible ways. And I think that the nonprofit sector is going to be the one that's able to bridge this gap over the next 20 years. And that as a field, we really have to hold those spaces where we take good care of people as they're managing really hard transitions. And we develop a vision of what the future could look like so that people are excited to get there together.
Fantastic. We've got a lot of great questions coming in. Here's another really good one. How do you see the role and job description of a program officer changing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think there's already been a lot of change. So early in my career, I was a program officer, and some pieces of the job felt very solitary. Like you're going through piles of grant applications, and sometimes you're looking up data. More program officers now are spending most of their time talking to community informants, talking to other grant makers, really collaborating in wonderful ways that I think are going to serve the sector well. And so I think there'll be an expectation in those future job descriptions that program officers just aren't somebody sort of analyzing, but there's somebody that is able to connect with others to develop a clearer picture of what's coming next.
And here's another good one. If you are a person who thinks about the future and see the trends, how do we get staff at our orgs to come along and help them see the path?
Oh, for sure. I think, we talked earlier about people being worried about the future. And I've given talks about, specific trends that I had an audience member at the end of one of those talks say, thank goodness I'm retiring soon and I don't have to deal with any of these changes. And it's like, well, if you were still on the planet, you still have to deal with changes. I think for people that are sort of visionaries within their organization, if you can see what's coming next, it's important to really develop your ability to communicate that with your peers. So what is the picture that you're painting? And I think anchoring those stories in the history of an organization is really useful for people that are worried about change. And so the story isn't about change, it's about natural progression from all of the great work that we've been doing. Now we're moving to this next place that I think helps people move through in a way that isn't that they're fighting against the future. I think it's really easy to sort of put your head in the sand and say, I don't want to listen to this, or drag your feet within your organization and make sure that change doesn't move forward. I think the pace is going to be too fast, and for people that are trying to slow change in that way, they're not going to be able to do that as much anymore.
Yeah, there seems to be a pretty consistent theme among our participants in terms of questions. There are a lot of questions coming up just asking, again, I'm a futurist, and I think about the future and I think about trends, but how do I get my leadership and those around me to follow me and buy into why this is important? So a lot of great questions around that.
Yeah, I think book clubs and sharing articles and those sort of things within organizations is a great way to create change. And so I forward articles about trends that I think are interesting to people without a lot of commentary. So it's sort of like, hey, thought you would think this is interesting, because what it allows that person to do is engage without judgment. So I think for leaders that are feeling uncertain about what's coming next, when they have staff members that are saying, hey, how come you're not paying attention to the XYZ trend? Here is something that backs up that that's important. They sometimes dig in a way that is not helpful at all.
Right.
So if instead you can, there's a book called The 360-Degree Leader that's about how to sort of lead up, down, and across within your organization. And I think a lot of that work of leading up is really understanding where is your leader trying to take the organization, and how can you help that path by describing future trends in a way that's accessible to them, and in a way that sometimes makes it feel like it's their idea to pay attention to what's coming next.
Super. This is kind of a follow-up to some information that you had given during your awesome presentation. This question is, thank you, Trista, for your incredible vision and advice. Please share again where to find your template for weekly work self-analysis.
Yep, so if you Google Trista Harris and weekly review, it should pop up. It's also on my blog, which is at tristaharris.org.
So one of the things I love about your messaging, Trista, is you tied a lot of kind of for-profit thoughts and realities to the nonprofit sector. And so there's a question here that says, I'm moving from a for-profit company to a nonprofit company. What should I be aware of and ready for as I enter the world of nonprofits? So around this whole future, thinking of the future, are there incredible differences that this person would experience in their transition from for-profit to nonprofit?
For sure. I think the piece that we often forget is that people in the nonprofit sector are trying to solve problems that both the government and business sector haven't been able to solve with a lot more time and a lot more money. And so it's organizations that may not have a lot of resources, but they are making humongous progress on issues. And I think sometimes we come into the nonprofit sector with the idea of, gosh, they must not be very sophisticated as they're doing this work, and so let me bring my for-profit ways. I think it's important to bring perspectives from many sectors, and that is the only way to solve the challenges that we're working on. There's no easy challenges left anymore, and everything that we're working on really takes both a government, business, and nonprofit push to be able to solve those issues. So think about what you can bring from the business sector that would be really useful. And then I would say start to read some of the nonprofit sector blogs and newspaper articles, the Chronicle of Philanthropy and those sort of things, to just think about how they're talking about issues in the field. And so for somebody coming from a completely different sector, a lot of it's just going to be translation. and understanding, we talk about it this way in the business sector and this way in the nonprofit sector. How do I use language that's useful as people are trying to communicate what's important?
Excellent. Another great question. How should program officers and others at foundations convene current and or former grantees, other funders, and a variety of stakeholders in the most meaningful ways?
For sure. I think sometimes funders over convene. So, if you have 40 foundations that are supporting your work and all of them want to convene you often so that you can give them advice about what they're thinking, that could be most of your time is sort of tending to your funders. And so I'm much more interested in foundations learning how to work together to ask those questions. I think it's useful when foundations pay grantees to be informants. And so, come to this focus group and we will pay for your time because we want your input. I'm really interested in efforts where nonprofits are convening together because they're hearing from community that there's a need that they can only meet by working together. Because I think that's where the best solutions come from. At very early in my career, I was a fundraiser, and our organization had a grant unallocated by the state government, which was the grant. We had spent most of the grant. They sent us a letter that said that they wanted all of the money back, which is problematic. So that grant was for a community coordination process. It was not my happiest moment as a fundraiser. And so in that process, what we found is that collaborating together as nonprofit organizations are when we came to really great solutions. And I think that sometimes we look for foundations to ask us to come together, but really it's when community is asking nonprofits to come together that powerful solutions happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have time for a couple more questions. If anybody has any to share, please do so. And another one here is: are there any unusual risks or opportunities that the nonprofit sector will face in the future?
Oh, for sure. I think changes that we've seen recently in tax law could be devastating for the nonprofit sector. So we've really lost the value of the charitable tax deduction in a way that I think isn't going to become very clear for the next couple of years. And I think that's where we're really going to have to get clarity about what that means for the sector. It isn't that people aren't going to be charitable anymore. It's that people are going to give to 501c4 organizations. They're going to give to their neighbors' GoFundMe campaign. There's a lot of other places that dollars can go. And if there isn't a weightiness to that charitable tax deduction, that's going to be a problem for many traditional organizations. So I think for nonprofits, we're going to have to learn how to tell our story in new ways, and we're going to have to, I think, be closer to the communities and causes that we're talking about so that we can tell better stories about that work.
Right. Great. Thank you so much. Let's see here. We do have one more question that popped in. Do you see the future of nonprofit organizations also being affected by demographic changes? For example, increasing percentages of people of color in our demographics?
Yeah, for sure. I think nonprofits have to change. And I think that nonprofits at the board, staff, and volunteer level need to be representative of the communities that they're serving. And it means that we need to recruit differently. We need to develop relationships differently than we have in the past. I also think that we're going to run into a time where some traditional nonprofits close down, really big ones that have been around for a long time. As you think about Netflix and Blockbuster. Blockbuster was a humongous company that seemed like it had a huge head start on Netflix. And they actually had the opportunity to buy Netflix a couple times and chose not to. And they completely shut down because they weren't able to bend to new community expectations and needs. I think the same thing is going to happen to nonprofit organizations. If you are not representing what your communities need, clearly because you're not connected to what community is asking for and not getting informed in that process, I think that funding is going to dry up really quickly, and some long-standing organizations are going to disappear in that process.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I was just checking here to see if there were any other questions. I don't see any other questions, Trista, other than lots of great accolades, folks saying thank you and how much they've really enjoyed the information that you shared with them today. So, thank you everyone for all of your great questions. And Trista, of course, thank you for all of your great answers.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Of course. So, of course, we want to keep the conversation going. So if you have additional questions, please let us know on social media. You can tag us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and use the hashtag SIPWebinar hashtag to document your postings, and we'll certainly get back to you with answers to those questions. Again, hashtag SIPWebinar. Great. So Trista, really, thank you again so very much for this incredible information. If you'd like to contact Trista, her contact information is available to you here on the screen. You'll also receive this information when you get the slide deck and a follow-up email in the next few days. Trista, just lastly, what is the most important takeaway you would want our participants to have from today's webinar?
For sure. I think the most important thing is that the future is in your hands. The decisions that you make today are going to impact what the future looks like. And so I hope that you take both that responsibility and opportunity really seriously, because together we can build a much better future.
Well said. Couldn't agree more. And then coming up, we have our December webinar, so please don't miss our next webinar on December 12th, Why Do Donors Leave?, which will provide tips for establishing a strong donor retention plan. So please don't hesitate, go ahead and register today for that December 12th webinar. And then lastly, a big thank you to our audience for your time and great questions. To help us continue to improve our monthly webinar series and ensure we are providing value to our audience, please take a few minutes to complete our survey. And with that, thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope that you enjoy tomorrow's National Philanthropy Day in your community. Enjoy the rest of your day today, and we'll look forward to seeing you on December 12th.